Hey everybody, this is Tim with the University of Vinyl, back with another video today, and this is my first ever night shoot. Welcome. Anyway, I was trying to get my lighting right, and it's not that easy if you have limited lighting and a small room. Anyway, I hope it looks good. So recently, I picked up a white label promo of a Cheap Trick album, Heaven Tonight, on a recent visit to a record shop. And I started thinking about, hey, let's do a little video about white label promos, how they actually came about, what they were for. Are they more valuable than your, the corresponding commercial releases of those albums? And just a little bit more about the history and why I think white label promos are really interesting, very collectible. So let's get started. So here in the modern times, if someone is going to release an album, there's usually a drip of a single, a second single, sometimes a third single that is released ahead of time of the album's release. And of course that's available on usually all the streaming services. NPR Music might do a feature or an interview depending on the stature of the artist. And so the general public also has the internet at their fingertips. And there's tons of opportunity to learn about artists, to learn about albums that are upcoming. But if we look back into the 1960s and 1970s, those were much different times. There was no internet. And the tastemakers out there were a couple groups of people. First of all, you had the disc jockeys at the major radio stations around, and I'm talking about America right now. I know I have viewers in other places, but just focusing on the United States. Anyway, the big time DJs at the major rock and roll channels around the United States they could influence people, they could influence listeners. And the record labels started to become hip to that in the early to mid 60s. They would start releasing singles, of course, before the album dropped. But even ahead of that, they would go ahead and issue these white label promos, and they would issue free copies to radio stations. And the disc jockeys would get their hands on them, and they could determine if they liked it, and they would start playing it. Before the record labels tried to have a little bit of influence, disc jockeys, it was a free-for-all. They could play what they wanted to play. Fast forward to the late 1970s into the 80s, and you've got your AOR, your album-oriented rock, and channels that were dedicated and never swayed from certain playlists. You would hear the same song once every 2 hours, and on and on and on. So white label promos. So the record labels would go ahead and press up a certain amount of white label promos, and they would be distributed out to the radio stations. Of course, the most influential radio stations would get them, and of course they would end up in the hands of the more influential DJs that worked at those channels. The second group of people were the music critics. So these people were also tastemakers. They had an audience, usually because of the publication that they were affiliated with. I can reel off a few names, just kind of knowing who they were at the time. Lester Bangs, he was writing for Cream magazine, eventually moved over to Rolling Stone. Robert Hilburn, longtime critic for the Los Angeles Times. Robert Christgau, he started at Esquire magazine in the 1960s and eventually moved to the Village Voice in New York. Very influential music critic. Gary Graff was in Detroit. Greg Kot wrote for the Chicago Tribune. He's got a good podcast, by the way. He's still around. And I had a couple other notes. Who else did we have? Grail Marcus for Rolling Stone. Grail Marcus was the guy, famous review when Dylan released Self-Portrait in 1970. The first sentence of Grail Marcus's Rolling Stone review was, "What is this shit?" So that's the kind of personality and clout some of these people had. There was one or two more. Cameron Crowe got his start at Rolling Stone magazine. I think I've named everybody. John Rockwell, New York Times. So radio DJs and music critics, they were beneficiaries of white label promos, along with industry insiders, other people that would maybe get a pre-release copy. So that's an interesting thing about white label promos. They were, as a rule, a limited release. And the second most interesting thing, or one of the more interesting things, at least as far as I'm concerned, if you could find these things in good condition, they sound fantastic. Why? White label promos were usually the first vinyl albums that were pressed from the mother stamper. Early run records. Hot stamper records are a thing. There are entities online who are making a living marketing and selling hot stamper records. These are records that were early off the press, and the earlier off the press compared to the 900th or 1000th, and earlier pressed records always sound better for the most part. So there's that. So you have hopefully very, very good sounding records. You have a little bit of collectible appeal because they actually have white labels. So you'll usually have the mark and the logo of the record company, but you won't have any colored artwork, and there's usually going to be something very, very distinctive or specific saying this is not for sale on that white label. And this is actually a 1966 George Jones album that I found recently. Now, this brings up another interesting tidbit about white label promos. In 1968-69, most of the leading radio channels in America moved away from the AM band and went FM. Prior to that, all the big channels were AM radio. And AM radio, what worked and sounded great on AM are mono pressings. There is another category of white label promos that are really interesting and really collectible. And those are white label promos that were pressed on mono after 1968 in smaller numbers, and they were provided to the AM channels in America. There were less rock-oriented channels that were on the AM band after 1968. So as a cause of that, or as a follow-on to that, there were less white label promo pressings. Now, it's hard to say how many white label promo pressings were pressed. Let's say after 1968. Was it 1,000? Was it 2,000? It's hard to say. I haven't been able to find any hard and fast rule. So we don't know that. When we talk about the value of white label promos, it's almost on a case-by-case basis. So there's a few things that work in the favor of something that's going to be more valuable. Is it from an iconic artist? Is it an important album from that iconic artist? Is it a controversial artist or a noteworthy album? Those are the kind of things that will work in the favor if you find a white label promo of that album. So, you know, this is a 1966 George Jones album, and I went on Discogs, and there's no real discernible bump in value with the white label promo, but it's pretty cool to have. If I see these out in the wild and they're not exorbitantly priced or overpriced, I'm going to pick them up because I think they're pretty cool. Here's that Heaven Tonight. And this is interesting because it has a listing of the tracks and the individual timing of each song. So obviously this is for radio channels, radio stations and DJs, so they would know what they were dealing with each song. And this was on the Epic label. There's that white label promo. Demonstration, not for sale. I have listened to this. This thing's in near mint condition and it sounds incredible. Now that's, you know, when we're talking about radio stations and DJs, in the old days, before things were really programmed and automated and computerized, this was a manual exercise, right? You're switching, you're dealing with several different techs and lining stuff up and queuing things up. I can just see albums being tossed into the corner, no regard for dust jackets, etc. So you will find older white label promos, unfortunately, that are probably beat up. I'm not interested in those. You want to get stuff that is in great condition. Anyway, this is a fantastic album. Heaven Tonight, Cheap Trick. My most recent video featuring great sounding albums that were pressed by the famous Bob Ludwig, the mastering engineer Bob Ludwig. One of those albums I showed was this 1975 self-titled Rupert Holmes LP. And that's also on the Epic label, just like that Cheap Trick album. 1975. And I got lucky with this one too. This thing is almost in near mint condition. Hardly any surface noise, sounds great. Pretty cool album to have. So the biggest prize that I have as far as white label promos are concerned is Van de Man Tupelo Honey 1971 album. Got that hype sticker on it. And it's on that Warner Brothers. Right at the top, promo not for sale. This thing's in near mint condition. Picked this up locally in Boulder for $50. I thought it was a fair price. I've seen these go north of $100 on eBay. So this would be an example of an iconic artist, an iconic album. You're going to see more value if you find a white label promo in great condition. Anyway, so that's Tupelo Honey, Van Morrison. When we moved into the 1980s, you saw less and less of white label promos. What the record companies moved to was that gold stamp typically. And those are usually stamped across the back barcode when barcodes came into play. They would put that right over the barcode so the barcode couldn't be scanned in case that album ended up somehow somebody wanted to try and resell it. So we moved away from white label promos. So white label promos are really a creature of the 1960s and 1970s. They're very cool to find if you can find them. I'm going to backtrack a bit. I wanted to also talk about there's a little story. Some of the music critics from the 60s and 70s, there's a famous story about Lester Bangs. Now, Lester Bangs worked for Cream magazine in Detroit before he moved to New York and went to work at Rolling Stone magazine. And he was known to basically, you know, a quarter of his income came from reselling all of the white label promos that he had. And he was known to hoard all the copies that came to the magazine publishing offices, and he would hoard those and resell those and basically come up with a partial income from reselling of white label promos. I just wanted to kind of hop on and talk about white label promos. They're an interesting little sidelight as far as this crazy hobby that we're all involved in. Take care. Have a great day. I hope to see you soon on the next video.